Hi,
everyone. We are going to get started in just a few minutes. We're going to let people come into the room, and Mark, we can promote Casey Gorel. That's what we're presenting this evening.
I'm sorry, Casey.
Yeah, at the very top.
Oh, there she is.
Yes, with a C.
Right.
And then,
And our board colleagues too, or no?
sure. Yes.
You said you've been to a couple of these same presentation.
Also, we're recording.
Oh, that's, thank you.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Hi,
Now.
Casey. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Mark, if we can just make sure that Casey can share the screen, which
I have done that, but let me just double check. And yes.
everyone, this is the outdoor dining working group thing. We will be getting started in just a few minutes. Casey, I see your note about Kate and Heidi, so take note of that. Yeah, we don't have any audio yet because we haven't started yet. So just give us just a few minutes. We'll get started in just a minute. Hi, Kate. Nice to see you. Thanks for helping get this organized. We'll get started.
Of course. Thanks. Hi, thanks for having us.
Kate, Shirley had a question.
Just
for you.
one question. Is somebody coming to the traffic and transportation meeting tomorrow night? Remember?
Yes. Yes, my colleague Jackie Lazzaro's going to be joining tomorrow.
Okay, great, great. Just in case with those open streets. Oh, here's Carter. Hello.
We're great. All right, so I want to go ahead and get us going. I know. Thank you to Casey and Kate from DOT for joining us this evening. So let me just get this started. It is 6:35 p.m. This is a meeting of the Manhattan Community Board 2 Outdoor Dining Working Group. I will quickly go around and just introduce who's on that working group and be very clear about what we're going to be hearing tonight and kind of what the parameters are for our conversation this evening. So I'm Valerie De La Rosa. I'm the chair of the Outdoor Dining Working Group. We have Shirley Secunda, who's our traffic and transportation chair. We have Carter Booth, who's a past CB2 chair. On Zoom from the committee, we have Stella Fitzgerald, who is on the land use committee and the traffic and transportation committee as well, as also as a pioneer in the temporary outdoor dining program, working on a big study that's been cited a bunch of places. We also have Donna Raftery, I think is in the shadow there, I can see,
Oh, yeah.
who is our SLA chair. And outdoor dining outdoor dining applications will go both to the SLA for CB2, as well as to this committee for the part that is not dealing with the alcohol. But for tonight's meeting, we really wanted to step back and really take a look at something that's a real core piece of specifically the sidewalk cafe part of the Dining Out NYC program. So I've worked with our liaison, Kate Scherer, who is helped get this organized. So thank you so much for your partnership, Kate. And I'm gonna have a presentation this evening from Casey Moore from DOT. Casey, I'll let you introduce yourself in just a moment. But if you want to get your screen set up and ready to go. Really quickly, before we get into that, can I have, we also have our CB2 chair, Susan Kent on as well, and past CB2 chair in the room, David Gruber. So I think I got everyone.
Past chair, Carter Booth.
Well, I did him as well. But really quickly, just to go on, we'll deal with the March minutes after the presentation. But if I can just have an motion to adopt the agenda.
I move to adopt.
Just a second, please. To adopt.
Second.
Okay,
Second.
great. Thank you. All right, so moving on with that. So Casey, I'm going to turn it over to you. Casey is going to present on the DOT pedestrian mobility plan and is much more qualified to tell you exactly what it is and what we'll be talking about this evening. But I really want to kind of make our focus for tonight is to focus on what is in that mobility plan. Casey's coming to us from the public realm unit, so this is not any sort of referendum on outdoor dining or about the application process for that. We discussed our process at our last meeting. We don't have any applications to review at this meeting, and so we are here wanting to understand how the clear path works and thought we would go straight to the source. I'm at DOT. So with that, I'm going to hand it over. So with that being said, what we will do after Casey, I swear I'm going to throw it to you in just a second. What we will do is we're going to have Casey present. As you have questions, if you want to put them, I think we have the Q&A feature on here. If you put your question in the Q&A, and I will go through the Q&A for anyone that's in the attendee list. I will call on the after the presentation, or if there's a question throughout from the committee, from the working group, or a board member, we'll have those in real time. But anything from the public, we will have through the Q&A function on Zoom. So there's a Q&A, it's got two little text boxes. So if you want to start adding your question there, and I'll try to aggregate them and get them asked. But we really are looking for about 30 minutes of presentation, if maybe longer, if there's a specific point, and then maybe 20 minutes for questions. So I'd like to get us wrapped up within the hour. I'm being cognizant of both Casey and Kate's time. So with that, Casey, I'm officially throwing it over to you now.
Great, thank you. Could you also add Heidi Wolf as a panelist? She just joined a little bit late. And she's going to be doing the intro, so I want to make sure she's ready to start.
Yeah, let me 1 second. Okay, I'm doing that right now. Yeah, it's on this one. Thank you.
Just while you're doing that, I can introduce myself. Hi, everyone. My name is Casey Grow. I'm from DOT's Public Realm Unit. And I've been working within the agency, working on the pedestrian mobility plan since about the end of 2019. So it's been kind of a long planning process that we've been working on. And we're happy to show it to you today. Let's see. I can pull up the presentation while Heidi gets up and running.
Great. I think we just moved her over. She just needs to.
Great.
Thank you. Did Heidi make it over?
No, I didn't.
Oh, I can do that. Sorry, now that I'm a co-host, thank you. Sorry, I'm promoting Heidi. Okay, I mean, she's moving over now.
Great.
Okay.
I don't think she realized she needed to register until the last moment. Then
Okay. All right. Heidi, are you on? Oh. Oh, okay, it's making a difference now. She should have moved over. Yeah.
Is she
Okay, she
ready?
just, no, she was on the attendee list and I promoted, but she disappeared. I promote her to panelist, Casey, but I don't see her appearing in either, so I don't know if we want to.
Who are you looking for?
Heidi,
Not on there.
she's not on.
Oh.
I promoted her, but she's not.
You lost her in the
Yeah.
promotion? Okay, that happens.
Can you reach out to her maybe,
yeah,
Casey?
I'm texting her right now to see if. Sorry, all.
Just a moment.
Usually this is a lot smoother.
Okay. Wait, plus, no. With one more person that added, it's not.
See her on the.
Yeah, I don't see her either. Do you want to go ahead and get started and then have
Yeah.
so
Just so we don't use up too much more of everyone's time, we can go ahead and get started. So good evening, everyone. We're here to present the New York City Pedestrian Mobility Plan, which is an initiative that DOT has been working on for several years now. And we'll kind of just jump right into the presentation. So for a little bit of a high-level overview, I am from the Public Realm Unit, and we do a lot of projects that focus on pedestrian mobility and public space throughout the city. We have here what we call our Public Realm feedback loop. So this is like how we develop projects, outreach with the community, engage and activate public spaces, and then also do a lot of comprehensive planning work. So the pedestrian mobility plan kind of fits within the framework of how we create and plan projects and develop policy throughout the city. So that's kind of where this plan is fitting within the larger public realm workflow and process. So why does New York City need a pedestrian mobility plan? So New York City is a city of walkers. So pedestrians are New York City's largest mode. 45% of New Yorkers consider walking their primary mode of travel or a significant element of their trip. And this is from the most recent mobility report that was put out in 2022. And another reason we need a pedestrian mobility plan is to really look at the pedestrian hierarchy of needs. So there's this a hierarchy pyramid here on the right side of the screen, which really looks at the pedestrian kind of needs, which go from at the very base level, we need passable pedestrian space. We then need accessible pedestrian space, which is really focused through ADA. We also want safe pedestrian spaces, and this is something that Vision Zero has been really forward thinking on. But if you look kind of at that top part of the pyramid, we don't really have anything that covers comfort and convenient pedestrian spaces and pedestrian mobility. So we're really looking for the pedestrian mobility plan to fill that missing gap to create comfortable and convenient pedestrian experience throughout the city. And we really want the pedestrian mobility plan to lead with uniformity and design standards for all pedestrian facilities throughout the city. The mobility plan also looks to make walking a more desirable experience and also increase the walking mode share. So as part of our sustainable city initiative, we really want to increase the amount of people who are walking as their primary mode of travel. It's the most sustainable form of travel, and it's the most space efficient form of travel. And one thing that we want the plan to do is really categorize streets based off of pedestrian generators and create corresponding design guidelines based off of those street categories. We also look to develop projects that increase pedestrian comfort and convenience that come out of the pedestrian mobility plan and prioritize projects based off of safety, equity, and pedestrian demand. So mode share and barriers to walking. One thing that's really interesting to note about New York City is that we are kind of a city of walkers throughout the entire city, maybe to varying degrees. So the map on the right shows the percent of commuters who walk or take transit as their primary mode for travel into work. And you can see it's really concentrated in the central part of the city, in Manhattan and in parts of Brooklyn and Queens. However, you can also see that there are parts of the city in the outer boroughs that also have a very high amount of walking. And that's shown on the left with just the difference between outer Queens and middle Queens, where walking is still a fairly substantial mode for people on their daily trips throughout the city. However, with all this walking, there's also a lot of barriers that prevents people from walking. So we've started to identify some of these issues as part of the pedestrian mobility plan. And the key ones to note are missing sidewalks or sidewalks that are there but are insufficient of width. There's also sidewalks that are there that are covered in barriers that prevent walking within the sidewalk that exists. And then we also are looking at a lack of crossings, especially on multi-lane streets. So pedestrians need to walk on a sidewalk and then they need to be able to cross the street to get where they're going. As part of this demand or as part of this mobility plan, we've created the pedestrian demand map to guide our thinking on this process. And the reason for creating this is to really prioritize pedestrians who have up until now been fairly left out in design requirements and also left out of a lot of planning analysis, more specifically at a countrywide federal level. The difficulty with pedestrians is that they don't function like a lot of other modes, where the focus for those modes is really getting from A to B. Pedestrians sometimes just go on walks without a general destination, maybe using walking as a mode of recreation, or maybe changing modes throughout their trip depending on their needs. Like someone walks to a bus stop, takes the bus, and then walks for the remainder of their trip. One thing we've also noticed is that sidewalks really lack some of the more stringent design and level of service requirements that other modes enjoy. There's a lot of modeling guidance and requirements for vehicles, even for bikes and buses with widths required for different types of lanes. But sidewalks really only have ADA guiding the minimum width for sidewalks to maintain accessibility, which is not really appropriate for a city of our scale. And we really believe that the pedestrian demand map and the categorization based on demand can help develop targeted design guidelines for all of our sidewalks. And one thing we do want to note, which is kind of the purpose of this meeting, is that sidewalks do function as more than just transportation. We're in a very dense urban environment, and our sidewalks function as meeting spaces, our spaces for restaurants and storefronts, and how you access private property. There's some of our green spaces, or they're places that just simply people watch. And while we understand that these uses are what make our city great and make a very vibrant and attractive place to live, we also want to ensure that our sidewalks have enough space reserved for them for the primary movement of people on their way to where they're going. And in order to ensure that our sidewalks accommodate that use, we really need to understand what is the pedestrian demand on these different types of streets. So we have created the pedestrian demand map, which creates 5 categories of street. Starting on the top left, this is the baseline street. This is the most basic type of sidewalk in the city, typically reserved for residential neighborhoods. And these are really where you really would only encounter maybe 1 or 2 pedestrians walking on the sidewalk at a given time. The next level up, we have the community connector. These are streets where we see groups of people who are maybe connecting to a retail corridor or walking to access a transit stop. So you usually see people in small groups walking or someone alone with their partner. We then move up to neighborhood corridor. These are the more standard neighborhood retail streets where you see predominantly groups of people walking to access neighborhood businesses and restaurants and see a larger uptick of pedestrian activity. The last 2 corridors are regional and global corridors. These are the really high tier high pedestrian volume streets in the city, with regional being large corridors in the boroughs, and the global corridors really being reserved for those really busy Manhattan avenues where you see crushing crowds of pedestrians on a typical normal day. So those are the 5 categories that make up the demand map. We've created the demand map using a lot of citywide data resources to really be critical of the corridors and a very data focused method for creating the map. So here on the left are the different indicators that we've used to identify pedestrian demand, items such as office density, retail density, transit, density of restaurants, school frontages, parks, and then minor parks and regional rail for community connector down on the end. And on the left, here's a zoom in of downtown Brooklyn as an example of how the network is created, where you have high dense pedestrian corridors that then reach out into more low-end streets as you get farther away from some of these centers and central business districts. And then looking out at a citywide scale, the majority of the city is comprised of baseline and community connectors, which is to be expected. A lot of the city has relatively low density or may have low pedestrian demand across the city. So that's 60% baseline and 25% community connector. And it's really this remaining 15% of citywide corridors that make up neighborhood, regional, and global that we really want to focus a lot of our design guidelines on, because that's where we do see higher amounts of pedestrians and higher pedestrian demand. So this citywide map is what then guides and informs a set of design guidelines throughout the city. So design guidelines. So to take one step back, we really want to define the anatomy of a sidewalk. So we've really tried to rethink the sidewalk to really determine what areas are required for functional use as transportation. So at the middle section, we have the clear path, and this is the portion of the sidewalk that we think really needs to be clear for pedestrian transit on the sidewalk, where it's free of amenities for uninterrupted pedestrian flow. We then have a little bit wider, this idea that we created called the walk lane. And this is really a space for the sidewalk that's reserved for walking, but may have interruptions or items in it as needed to kind of create that vibrant streetscape that we know is crucial to the livelihood of the city. But it still allows for passing or places for people to step to the side to like have conversations or to like get their bearings while not interrupting that clear path of travel. But can also function as flexible space for walking. We then have the furniture zone, the furnishing zone, which is the section of the sidewalk between the curb and the walk lane that really hosts a lot of these elements that occur consistently across all sidewalks throughout the city. So this includes street trees, signs, hydrants, and such. We then created a set of recommended widths for each of these sidewalk categories. And we're really using these as like a starting point to have conversations as we go through either design or policy development to really set the expectation of this is what we would like to see on each of these corridors. So starting at the bottom for baseline, we're looking at a 5-foot walk lane. That's your typical 5-foot wide sidewalk flag, which is kind of the piece of concrete that a sidewalk is made up of. And we're looking for a 4-foot clear path, which is in line with the proposed latest recommendations from ADA. For community connector, we're looking at an 8-foot wide walk lane. That's really to accommodate people passing kind of in either direction. That's where we see higher pedestrian volumes and demand, where people may need to navigate crossing and passing through someone else. Neighborhood corridor is a 12-foot wide walk lane where you could accommodate groups of people passing in either direction. Regional corridor is 15, and global corridors where we get up into very high and wide widths with a 20-foot wide sidewalk or walk lane on either side to really accommodate those crowds of people. So think 42nd Street or 8th Avenue, where you have mass numbers of people walking in either direction at a given time. The next design guideline is identifying the amenity zone. So this is within the furnishing zone along the curb line. And we really see amenities as enhancing the streetscape, and they can enliven the public realm, but they can sometimes disrupt pedestrian movement if they can create walls or are very long and create barriers. And so since walk lanes are where people are moving, we really want amenities to be spaced appropriately to provide that passing area or flexible use space. And then anything outside of the walk lane for amenities can be spaced anywhere and up to their own siting guidelines as needed. So we really, we use street trees as one of the guiding principles for these because we know street trees are a very impactful part of the pedestrian experience, and we wanted to make sure that they were heavily accommodated. So we're creating our guidelines around their siting guidelines, which is a 10-foot wide tree pit every 15 feet. So you have 15 feet of passing flexible pedestrian space and then a 10-foot tree pit, which we found on streets that have this type of treatment. It provides that regular space for flexibility within the walk lane. Pedestrian mobility treatments. So we have these guidelines, we have the demand map. How do we start to use them and implement them throughout the city? So DOT has many tools to help address some of these barriers to comfort and convenience. They can coincide with treatments that we use for Vision Zero to improve safety. But we kind of created this subset of very pedestrian focused and pedestrian mobility focused goals and treatments that both center around equity, access, parity, and health to increase the safety, comfort, and convenience of pedestrians. And the 3 main categories are super sidewalks, comfortable connections, and streets for people. I will get into. So super sidewalks, this is something that we're kind of starting to brand as like a new treatment that really prioritizes sidewalks as space for people walking. And they come in several categories, not all of which we've implemented recently, but the first category is a new sidewalk. So implementing pedestrian infrastructure to really facilitate connections to other modes or to transit. We then have something called an expanded sidewalk, and this can either be on a partial block where it's a small scale implementation where it maybe goes around something that's on the sidewalk or just provides extra flexibility, or potentially it's a space where we can move some of those furnishings out of the general travel path and out of the walk lane to improve pedestrian accessibility and comfort and convenience. We also have full expanded sidewalks that go a full block. This is something that we've been doing in Midtown recently on 7th, 8th, 9th, Lexington Avenues, where we fully expand the sidewalk to achieve that width to really accommodate pedestrians who are traveling from block to block along an entire corridor. We also have a treatment called corner curb extensions. These are where we widen the sidewalk at the corner, typically into a parking lane. And this provides flexibility and more walking space, specifically in this example around a transit structure to provide clear path and walking space around some of these obstructions that occur on the sidewalk. They also provide space for queuing, so people who are queuing for a signal don't impede the path of travel for people who are continuing along the corridor. We also want to think about once you get to an intersection, are you comfortable when you make your connection across the intersection? So we utilize treatments such as mid-block curb extensions to shorten crossings and provide more additional queue space to keep people from blocking other people. We have pedestrian islands that provide queuing space in the middle of the street and shorten crossings and calm turns across crosswalks. A big thing that DOT has been done, specifically the public realm unit, is simplifying intersections. So shown here is a large curb extension that pulls one of the streets away from another intersection to simplify operations and provide more pedestrian space at the intersection. And then we also have our controlled crossings and our enhanced crossings, which provide crosswalks at intersections to connect people across from sidewalk to sidewalk. The final category is streets for people. So this is a relatively new, even a relatively growing program that we have at DOT. So looking at open streets and open street schools to really increase pedestrian space, either at all times or maybe in those times when you really need it, such as school streets where you can close a street for dismissal and arrival to really allow people access and not have everyone crowded onto narrow sidewalks. We also have a toolkit called Shared Streets, where we create flexible space in the roadway where it can be used by all roadway users to decrease crowding on sidewalks, increase public space while still maintaining some regular vehicular access. And then the kind of upper tier is full pedestrianization through a plaza, where we create fully pedestrian space, which can help shorten intersection crossings, widen sidewalks to reduce crowding, and provide very flexible open public space. Here's an example of comfort and convenience, showing a before after of that intersection I noted previously, where we expanded sidewalk space to shorten crossings, but also provide extra flexibility space for pedestrians who are transiting along the sidewalks, because the sidewalks were fairly crowded in the before condition. So what does this mean? What's happening with the pedestrian mobility plan? And what do we see as changes in the future? So from a high level, we do see this as a living document. It's structured in a way to capture the evolution of New York City and accommodate changes ahead. So we do plan to do updates of the demand map as the city changes to accommodate those uses. This will be specifically focused on rezonings or changes in land use, the creation of new transit hubs if that occurs. But we also do want to do updates that take into account community expertise. So we did this at a citywide scale, but we don't all live everywhere in the city. So we don't have some of that innate knowledge and detail that people do have about their own neighborhoods and sidewalks, because not everything can be accounted for at a citywide data planning level. So we do want to get some of that very on the ground expertise from New Yorkers. So we do have a link to the website where all of this currently lives. It's on the DOT homepage under pedestrians and then pedestrian mobility. We also have an email that can be used to give feedback on the map, which is on the webpage. If you see something that you think needs to be tweaked or changed, you can send that to the email and we can take a look at it in the greater context of the demand map. And that is my last slide.
Great. That was great, Casey. Thank you so much. I'm sure that I see we have a couple of questions in the Q&A, and I'll go to the ones that are relevant to this subject matter just a second. But does anyone on the working group have any questions you want to ask about this?
Yeah, I guess I do.
Okay.
I really think you've covered most of what I'm going to ask about, but I just wanted clarification. I wrote down my questions. So, where do you see seating occurring? Because it seems to me that's what people need the most. They talk a lot about needing a place to sit. And I wondered how much attention you had given to where to put the seating, what kind of seating, transit stop seating, etc. So that's one question. You want to ask all my questions or one at a time?
Let me just answer them one at a time, because then I'm worried I'll forget one if there's too many. So for seating, I think that's like a really important thing, and that's something that we don't necessarily like consider as part of this plan. I
Well-
do think seating is something that's very important to comfort and convenience for pedestrians, especially for our senior population. We do have at DOT our city bench initiative, which does the benches throughout the city. And as that relates to the PED plan, what we've done is we've designated the furnishing zone as that's where it would go. I do think though it's interesting to think about like if you're wanting to put a bench somewhere, do you put it somewhere where you're going to get the most people who would potentially use it? And maybe that's where you use the demand map to say, we're going to focus on these neighborhood corridors because that's where the retail is. That's where we're going to like see the most people who might use it. And maybe we don't put it on a baseline street because there might just be one pedestrian an hour who walks by there. So maybe that's not a as good of use of resources as putting it on an upper tier category of street.
So when you said that you're not really focusing on the seating, is there some plan to focus on in the future?
Yeah, our city bench team, our street furniture team, they do their own kind of planning level work. So this will be kind of folded into that, but they have their own initiative. They're also looking at a lot of more like racial justice impacts, like more justice, environmental justice communities to do a lot of work for city benches, I know in the future. But they kind of have a different framework of how they do their work. But they will be layering this into some of their thinking as they go forward.
Be great if you can coordinate. I hope you can. Okay, so next. So you were talking a lot about transportation, in other words, movement on the sidewalk. But you did also talk about streets for people. So is it some kind of balance? Can you talk about that? The balance that you're looking for? Because at first, when you were talking about the sidewalk, you were simply talking about the accessibility for a certain number of people to move on the sidewalk. But then it sounded really encouraging, like you were going beyond that to think about what was going on the sidewalk in general. That would be make people more comfortable on the sidewalk and have more space on the sidewalk and that kind of thing. We're really doing more than just walking, maybe for socializing, maybe for looking in store windows and so on.
Yeah, I
So-
think there's kind of a lot of optionality when it comes to even just accommodating the simple process of walking down the street. We
Yes.
do have shared streets and plazas in here because we do have corridors that we think if you were to implement the pedestrian mobility plan widths, you actually don't have enough right of way. Like the width from building line to building line isn't wide enough. So you don't have the space to widen the sidewalk. So do you have to do a different treatment to really get the amount of pedestrian space you need for mobility? So that's why we have it in here as an example of a treatment, because we do think there will be spots where we need to almost go all the way to pedestrianized spaces just to accommodate mobility. Because we are a city of some very narrow streets, especially down in Lower Manhattan, and in your district as well. So it's just something we're considering as a toolkit option.
Right, let me see what else, if I have any other questions. I put a couple down, but you may have answered them already. Yeah, so I guess that really relates, I put down comfort and amenity, but that's kind of all related to what I just was asking about, which was the seating and just making sidewalks more attractive and appealing to be walking on. And you were talking about trees, and wondered if you had any other thoughts in mind in terms of just making the experience of walking on the sidewalk more attractive and enjoyable.
Yeah, I think let me actually go back to the hierarchy. This is going to be a little
Yeah.
fast for everyone watching, but I think one thing is that like we really before the pedestrian mobility plan, we had a city bench program, we have a street tree program, we have all these things that make sidewalks enjoyable, to use a word that you said, which is at the top of this pyramid. And I think from the mobility plan's perspective, when we talk about comfort and convenience, we're like when we say comfortable, at least in my mindset of comfortable, I'm thinking like not being like shoulder to shoulder with another pedestrian, not being scrunched and just feeling like I can't breathe when I'm on a sidewalk that's so crowded. That's kind of the level of comfort that like you should just be able to like stroll down a sidewalk and not be crushed. You should be able to like comfortably enjoy yourself as you walk down the street, just from a basic level of space. I think that's like one of the foundational things that we're doing with this plan, where before there was nothing guiding that or really even thinking about that at the city level prior to the pedestrian mobility plan. But I do think all your points are very valid, that there's a lot of other layers that go into making a very enjoyable, comfortable, and convenient sidewalk space throughout the city.
So is that something to be thinking about for the future, that DOT would, once you straighten out, well, straighten out would not be the word, but make it clearer as to where you need to accommodate more crowds and that kind of thing. Would the next phase be to add to that kind of environment?
Yeah, so we are using this to guide a lot of the city's work. So some of those corridors, like 8th Avenue, Lexington, and some of the other Midtown corridors, a lot of that came from this, from identifying these as key corridors. And we do look to guide some of our, excuse me, both in-house and capital work to meet the pedestrian plan guidelines and goals.
Okay, my last question, because I'm thinking that if you make a sidewalk better, then you're also making it more appealing for walking. So is that also behind it? Is to promote more walking?
Yeah, that's a big goal of this, is to really make, walking is the biggest mode, but it could be even bigger. And there's so many trips that people could do just by walking. And we do think making walking easy and comfortable will make more people do it.
And that's all my questions.
Thank you, Shirley. Casey, I thought it was really interesting how a majority of the city is, you said, was baseline and community corridor streets, right? Whereas here in our district, being 14 now, 4th Avenue, Bowery, and Hudson River Park or West Side Highway, we have the higher mix, right, of the regional corridor, the global corridor, and the neighborhood corridor. And I think in places that are unexpected to people that would assume a certain street is perhaps a lower designation, et cetera. And so, we're trying to understand kind of, this is not regulatory, right? The pedestrian mobility plan is not a regulatory document, and again, like there's going to be some sort of 2024, right, this year, of like an actual report, right, where it's a more dense kind of PDF of the material. Is that correct?
It's something we're thinking about. We're still figuring out the exact release of the plan, but that's kind of still in the works for this year.
And so my question is, when people see kind of the different counts of the clear path in this document, and let's say they look at, the outdoor dining regulations, and they see that there's a difference, which one supersedes, or how should people interpret that? And again, just trying to think of the larger picture of the clear path being presented across other agencies as well, such as SAFO and anything dealing with street activities. And the last part of that question is, how is this syndicated across the city to other agencies?
I'll start with the final question about how this is communicated. So we are presenting this as guidance and recommendations. It's really to start the conversation at, this is DOT standpoint, this is what we think should be.
Yeah.
But because it's not regulatory, there might need to be some discussions about what happens. Like if Parks is putting in a tree and it doesn't meet our clear path requirements, are we necessarily going to like not put the tree in? Maybe not, probably not, because it's, Parks' goal. But it's like the start of the expectation. You ask for DOT review of this thing. This is where we're coming from. We're doing that a lot with the MTA elevator implementation. They're putting them almost predominantly on sidewalks. It's where we also have the highest number of pedestrians. So when we see things, we say, this is what we would like to see on these corridors. We've done this like broad citywide analysis. This is the level that we need to meet. In regards to how this relates to potentially conflicting items, because this isn't regulatory, the regulations would take precedent. So we are framing this as guidance and recommendations, not as legally binding design like requirements. We are though looking for more opportunities to implement it as part of like formal policy. So that is something we want to see and continue to work on throughout the next couple of years, is start to find other policy changes that could be made to actually make the pedestrian mobility plan potentially more regulatory in nature. That just requires a lot of coordination with other agencies, other departments, and even within DOT. There's a lot of conflicting needs even within DOT of what goes on sidewalks. So there's a lot of negotiation goes with those conversations.
David.
Excuse me. Hi, I'm David Gruber, Casey. Thank you for a very good presentation. Just tell me again, clear path is 8 feet?
So it changes based off of what the corridor is. That's kind of one of the things we really wanted to get out of the pedestrian plan. Previously, it was basically there was one citywide clear path. So whether you were out on some corridor in Queens in Bayside, or if you were in Times Square, you had the same clear path. And to us, that didn't really make a lot of sense. So we use this process to create these clear paths as noted here that range from 4 to 15 feet, that then have the walk lane that ranges from 5 to 20 feet.
So I think my colleague Valerie gave some very good questions. So these are unenforceable guidelines. These are just guidelines. They're not regulations at this point, right?
Correct.
Okay. So in guidelines to whom? For architects, designers, for open restaurant. I mean, who are the guidelines for the city? Talk to us about what it means to have non-enforceable guidelines, and who's the recipient, and who do you envision using these guidelines?
So at this time, we really would like to have the audience for this be anyone who's doing really anything on the sidewalk, or even anyone who's advocating for something to happen on their sidewalk. So it gives a starting point for someone who's saying, my sidewalk is crowded, I would like something to be done about it. This is what this recommended, and then like advocate for either a potential project or change. We're also using it to, as I stated earlier, provide guidance and expectation setting when other agencies are putting something on the sidewalk, such as an elevator, like really pushing that we need to preserve this amount of pedestrian space for transportation when your infrastructure is being installed on city property. We do want to push this to the private developer architects and designers to really think about when you're designing a new big building, you're adding all this more pedestrian demand. Let's consider widening sidewalks as part of that project to really meet the guidelines and the goals of the pedestrian mobility plan. So at this point, it's really targeted for everyone for more of an awareness and advocacy standpoint, because it's not regulatory. But we do really think it also helps spur the conversation of people thinking about walking in this way, because up until now, the really only guiding principle was ADA, which was 3 feet, which is very narrow. And there wasn't really anything to spur people to think, let's do more.
Yeah. And as Valerie mentioned, this district, we have the trifecta here. It's a very old historic district. Some of our streets are extraordinarily narrow, and yet we have probably more restaurants and outdoor dining than any other district in the city. Make that the state. Thank you. And we're destination. So we get, we get pedestrians here far in excess of the population that lives here. And so I was encouraged to hear that the city is thinking about wider clear paths and walk lanes. And you're right, they haven't looked at that before, but it seems like now the regulations for, say, open restaurants will be a higher priority than yours, because they're regulatories and yours are just guidelines. Did I get that right?
Correct.
Okay.
And it's been incorporated in there, it's like the comparison, right? Thanks for having that chart up. So when you look at a global corridor street in the plan, it asks for a 15-foot clear path, but in the regulations, we know that that's 12, in outdoor dining. And that's just to Casey's point, right? That these are a guide, and that those been taken by the policymakers who wrote the outdoor dining regulations, and they made.
I understand.
Huh?
No, I understand.
Yeah, and they made this the 8 feet for, the neighborhood corridor and all of that. The other question that I had, if you could go to that slide with the methodology, or it kind of outlines the methodology of what went in there, because I think there's a lot of questions, and there's a question in the chat. Excuse me, in the chat, sorry, in the Q&A, there's a question in the Q&A, I think some people are trying to make sense of the different categories by saying, well, if this street is this many feet, then why is, for example, I guess here, I don't think a lot of people would think of Bedford Street as being a neighborhood corridor. But there's, kind of what the width of the sidewalk, sometimes it doesn't fit with the corridor, but that's because of these other, is it because of these other items, like let's say within the neighborhood corridor, different retail per square foot? People are trying to make sense of this plan by the width of the street. And when the width, they think it falls within the a certain number, but the street is classified as something else. Is it because of these other factors, or I guess people are trying to understand the methodology, because it seems thinking of common sense, maybe certain streets seem like they would be a smaller, they feel more like neighborhood or community connector, corridors, but they're really neighborhood or even regional.
Yeah, so I can breeze through this. This has this spent like 2 years making this map, and I summarized it in like a minute. So I think one thing to separate is that this map does not represent existing conditions from a sidewalk perspective. It represents what our expected demand on that street is. So you could have a global corridor. I don't think any of this exists, but you could have a global corridor where the existing sidewalks are 5 feet wide. Like that's the existing sidewalk widths. The existing roadway width has nothing to do with the categorization. It truly is an estimate of how many people would use that street based off of the land use designations and the land use. So that's kind of like the guiding principle of the map. One other thing that I didn't mention previously is that there's also one of the goals with creating the demand map was that we didn't have blocks like go back and forth a lot. So you wouldn't have like a baseline and then one block's a global and then the next block is a baseline. One, because that's not really how our streets like function in reality, is people walk kind of continuously. And also from like a design, like construction standpoint, you wouldn't want your sidewalk to like fluctuate that much in like reality. So we did a whole process where we smoothed the corridors to try to kind of even out some of those like ups and downs. So there's a potential for some variance where you're like, well, I don't feel like my block is a neighborhood. I'm more of a community connector. But if the 2 blocks beside you are neighborhood, maybe it makes sense to connect through as one consistent corridor, because people might be traveling on your block to get to the next block. So that was like another principle of this map, is to try to create the most consistent corridors possible to make design, implementation, construction, all those a lot more easier. But also just have it be, another thing about the map is that it's also a starting point. This isn't necessarily like, it's the start of a conversation. So it's, if someone thinks their corridor is a little too high, if there's a project to go in on that corridor, maybe it doesn't happen. Maybe the sidewalks don't get built out as wide as they need to be, or maybe they get built out more because there's more restaurants or something happening on this one individual block and it needs more space. Like that's also totally fine. The map,
many restaurants per 100 square. I read the 2-page methodology on the website, right? That it goes into a little more detail, right, for each one, and it's kind of what this slide is, right? So this would kind of answer the question of how does DOT determine a category a street should fall into? And it's taking all of these different data points, right? And I'll let you answer it. I want to answer the question for you.
Yeah, we take all the data points and they're all ranked, and that creates our essentially like each corridor, each block face gets a score, and then we apply that throughout the entire corridor. For the like per 100 feet, what we did is we normalized a lot of this by like a standard length. So if you had a block that had, you know, 10 office buildings and it was a really short block, it would get normalized versus a really long block that also had 10 office buildings. So it didn't skew the results because the block length is variable. So we wanted to create consistent scaling for each of these indicators. So all of those that have like a per 100 foot, that's just normalizing the density based off of the length of the block.
Got it. And someone had
Yeah, I just wanted so one of the big questions here to kind of, this is a general presentation on the pedestrian mobility plan, but one of a lot of the questions we have are the intersection with this and the Dining Out NYC program. So I think the most interesting part that has come out of this is the categorization of streets within our community board. And people have been surprised at some of those, which streets have been noted as which type of corridors. And particularly the regional corridor and the neighborhood corridors, because we have many non-conforming uses within the zoning. And when you overlay the DOH-MH information, which you use to categorize that, some of the streets end up with very different categorizations that are in residential neighborhoods than people think of. And so I just want people to know that's why those streets, just as you've been in a little bit more technical fashion, right? Why some of those streets are categorized that way. But just to go back, it doesn't mean that the sidewalk should be that wide, because there are existing streets, correct? But this is, you've looked at the density of the use through those permits, and that's why their streets have designations, and as a result, certain streets require a 10-foot clear path, which is the minimum for any outdoor dining is 8. But the 10-foot is where this kicks in. And that's the change from before for people. But the calculation is made with the existing restaurants in mind and the use, and that's why it has a wider corridor. I'm just, can you talk about that a little bit? When you look at your larger map, we're the dense area. That's a lot of the dark colors, and right, or a lot of the yellow, red, green, and maybe if you could just talk about that and why, from a planning perspective, pedestrian use. I mean, it would clear up a lot of questions, I think, from members of the community.
Yeah, I mean, just noting that your district is a very dense district. It has a lot of pedestrian trips. It has a lot of pedestrian demand. And it has a lot of uses going on. So even like restaurants is only really one indicator in this entire process. Like it's not even, it's probably not the biggest indicator. General retail space and office space is a huge indicator as well. So there's also these other uses, like you might have a lot of restaurants on a block and office space above them. And that's contributing to all this extra pedestrian generation and pedestrian demand. But yes, to your point, so the restaurant indicator is from the Department of Health permits. So it's the number of active permits per block, or at the time of the creation of the map, not necessarily a live document. But that's what's driving that indicator, is the density of active restaurant use. I think it does, though, point to some of the limitations, like at a citywide scale. Like, a coffee shop is different from a big 100-table restaurant, but it's something we're not able to account for, is the like minutia detailed use of that space. Whereas like even within office space, a doctor's office has way less pedestrian trips than, say, like a standard like commercial office space. So there's always going to be some flexibility within this, and there's always going to be things that we aren't able to like pinpoint and determine for every single block throughout the entire city. So there are some generalizations and limitations of the process, but we do think it is representative of the demand within the 5 categories.
And how does, like, do you have anything like housing units or housing type or anything in that model or no, in terms of thinking of like the resident density?
So we do take residential density into account, mostly to, let me go back to the other one. So a lot of these indicators are more like business or just non-residential use. But from like at a very high level, a lot of higher density residential is really relatively close in proximity to a lot of the higher density office use or any high density use, density clusters around each other. But we do have residential as an indicator to differentiate between baseline and community connector. So it's on the more lower end of the spectrum. If we were to incorporate higher density for residential, we found that it actually kind of like it double represents with some of the other indicators that we were already using. So we didn't include it as its own indicator because it was showing us things that were already being shown up in the model.
Stella had her hand raised for walks and hasn't asked anything yet. Stella, did you have something you want to add or else?
Yeah, I had a question that I, in a way, ended up answering on my own, but I'll ask anyway because I think it could be interesting. Thanks for presenting, by the way. My question was if you know if there is a map that DOT has produced that reflect current, like the existing conditions that this map, the mobility plan map doesn't reflect in terms of sidewalk widths. And if I ended up finding one not produced by the city, but looks like it was a project someone made during COVID to see if if social distancing was possible on different streets, which is interesting. But has DOT considered making a map like this if it doesn't exist to kind of overlay the ideals and the guidelines with the current conditions at all?
That's an excellent question and like an excellent talking point because before that social distancing map, I don't think anyone ever asked, do you have a map of the city sidewalk width? Because no one had ever really thought about it before, which really points to like why we wanted to create the pedestrian mobility plan because no one was really considering these things. We don't have an official map. So one of the big challenges with mapping sidewalks is getting the data. Most of like mapping like street width is actually, it comes from the like mapped zoning text. So it's a relatively easy number to get. Sidewalk width is relatively tricky. It's something we're working on. We're trying to figure out a way to get accurate sidewalk width data. And one of the biggest challenges is especially in like a district like yours, where like the sidewalk kind of bleeds past into private property, and it's sometimes hard to tell like where the back of sidewalk is. And if you're going to map sidewalk widths, do you do the legal back of sidewalk, which is the property line, or do you include the private property? So there's a lot of like kind of nuance to that. Your district has like a lot of stoops and like vaults and stuff that happens at the building line, and those are very difficult to map. But it's something we're working on, and we would like to get to a point where we have an official sidewalk map. It's just the more we've looked into it, it's very difficult to create at a citywide level.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
And DOT and DCP measure sidewalks width differently, is that correct?
I'm not aware of a difference. That I'm not sure about. I don't know.
Or maybe I'm thinking of street width. Maybe I'm thinking of street width. Yeah, maybe I'm thinking of street width. Anyway, it's just off the top of my head. Shirley, did you want to ask your question?
I just wanted to clarify. So you were saying that the usual use categories are measured like residential, commercial, and retail, and the density. But in our neighborhood, it's often none of those things. It has to do with just tremendous density of visitors, whether they be tourists or whether they're just people coming to this area. And do you measure, is there a way to measure that? The actual density of use of the sidewalk and street?
Yeah, no, that's actually like a great point. Tourists are really hard to pin down. It's very difficult to find data indicators that show where they are. Like one thing that's like kind of interesting that like isn't included here is like large institutions, like the Met Museum is not included in this analysis. And we considered it, but then we found out that there's actually a lot of Department of Health permits in the Met for restaurants within the Met. So it showed up as a regional already on its own. It actually came up as a global. So tourists are just a very hard thing
Yeah.
because they kind of just wander on their own.
I mean, it's only tourists, it's all the people that go to school here, say,
And we
just-
do include schools, and we do like tourists also follow retail and restaurants. They kind of trickle along those lines. So we did think that those indicators accomplish the visitors category of pedestrians because they're obviously going to some of these other generators.
Great. How does this, is this something that is formally adopted or is it voted? Like, how does it become this best practice, or is it just something that DOT says that's
It's just a guideline.
like, is there any, because when you call something like a plan, right, it seems as though it's something that's formally adopted. And so can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that's like something we're still trying to figure out because which there's actually this didn't make this presentation, but there's also a lot of lack of clarity over regulation of just stuff in the sidewalk in general, and it's done by almost every single agency. So one of the first things that we've been doing is trying to categorize who has jurisdiction over things on the sidewalk or the sidewalk itself. Before we start finding ways to implement these guidelines to be requirements for different policies. So something from like, you know, the A-frame sandwich board signs, those are entirely managed by Department of Sanitation. Like we have no jurisdiction over those. The like storm doors that go over like bodegas or something that like the like winter doors, like those are managed by a completely different agency. So there's so many agencies who have oversight over the stuff on the sidewalk that it becomes a challenge of figuring out how do you implement these guidelines at that broad scale. And it's something we're still working through. We're starting to like look at what could be some easier lifts to get this baked into existing regulation without having to do a vote or anything. It would just be changing internal DOT rules. So we're still having those conversations internally about what that would mean. But the goal is to maintain these as guidelines and start working them in as needed into larger initiatives as we go forward.
So if
Work it into.
that, I didn't know that about the A-frames. So if there's an A-frame next, like an outdoor dining set up on the sidewalk that's blocking the clear path, then when that complaint goes in, that doesn't go to DOT, that goes to DSNY.
This is totally off the cuff, and I have no idea if this is 100% accurate, but my assumption would be that it would go to DOT to tell the restaurant you need to move your stuff off the clear path because it's your stuff tied to your stuff.
Okay.
But that's like, that's
Got it, okay.
my
sorry.
assumption, but not my.
Okay, sure. Okay, and then let me see if there's what other questions are on here that are related to this topic. Someone has asked, many sidewalks already in very poor condition. Is the DOT responsible for repairing them even after you expand or do whatever you end up doing, or is it the building or business inevitably responsible? I think.
In general, private property owners are responsible for their sidewalks outside of their properties from a state of good repair standpoint. If DOT is to come in and do like a reconstruction, the city does take on that responsibility. And if we come in and rebuild a whole avenue, the city pays for the sidewalk replacement. Unless there are to my knowledge at least, unless there are outstanding fines for sidewalk condition, then that gets sent to the property owner. But in general, if a sidewalk is existing and it's in poor condition, it is the responsibility of the property owner.
And is there some sort of best practices, like the best use of like the percentage that a neighborhood corridor or a regional corridor should have of a mix of things, like to the optimal use of the public realm? It's a very general question, I know, but just.
Yeah, I don't think this really gets to that. So I don't think this would have like recommendations for like distribution of stuff or like percentages or such.
And then as far as kind of thinking of the role of community boards and other community districts across the city, kind of how does DOT envision these guidelines being used by community boards?
Well, you're the first community board we've presented to, so this is still an evolving learning process. I think that's like yet to be determined. I don't think we have like a set strategy for this or like a set like guiding principle. I think at a very basic level, it's more about just like knowledge sharing. It's like letting people know that like this is something that the city sees as an important issue. It can help with advocacy. As I mentioned earlier, I think it's something that like we'd also like to get feedback on the map from community boards and community members, because you have innate knowledge of your community that we might not have, because we didn't walk every street to make this map. That wasn't feasible. Yeah, I think at this point, we don't really know what all could come out of a relationship of presenting and getting feedback from community boards yet, because we haven't really done it yet.
Any other questions from board members or from the working group?
I just wanted to say this plan is in existence, it's not proposed. And the order, this existed prior, correct me if I'm wrong, Casey, to the creation of the Dining Out NYC program, but maybe you could talk about why this was used to formulate the rules and for Dining Out NYC. Maybe you could just talk to people about why.
Yeah, I think so I guess for the plan, this was started at DOT internally in 2019, and it was worked on intensively by staff through the beginning stages of the pandemic, and it wasn't really formalized through an agency level until relatively recently. The website launched not more than a year ago, I don't think, with the kind of basic structure of the plan. And we really hadn't started really going public with the plan until relatively recently. In regards to outdoor dining, I think we really saw the plan being an opportunity for a starting point and a starting conversation to identify that the existing sidewalk regulation of 8 feet applied citywide didn't really make too much sense, because corridors are different throughout the city and streets are different throughout the city. So we proposed the pedestrian mobility plan as the starting point, which then led to the final guidelines and conversations between multiple agencies and governance groups to determine the final guidelines. But like I'd said kind of previously, we always view the plan as it's the starting point for a conversation and the creation of policies and guidelines throughout the city.
I mean,
You want to take questions from the public?
we did from the chat.
If anybody has anything else to.
We'll just take out my Q&A. It's not right. So I was gonna do. So let's see, last questions. People were asking if any recommended guidelines for having a set aside, I guess, on a sidewalk for passenger pickup. Okay.
Let me go to the design guidelines. There's not really like There's not really a guidance from this plan that identifies anything for passenger pickup. It would more be from like the individual guidelines for what's in that furnishing zone that provides space for passenger pickup. This plan doesn't really focus too much on like the relationship between the sidewalk and the adjacent curb lane. It's more just focused on the sidewalk itself. So no, I don't think we have really guidance on pickup drop-off areas on the sidewalk.
See Susan Winberg has her hand up.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment on when you said you were taking into consideration that different districts have different street width issues. And, you know, one thing with ours, and I know heard you say you didn't walk every street, clearly we can't expect you to do that, but we are so unique and so not the formula that fits anywhere else I can think of in the rest of the city. And that, you know, when you were even saying earlier, there are no streets that are, you were talking about 8-foot streets that didn't fit the global description. We have everything that no place else has. And I'm always concerned, especially with open restaurants, outdoor dining, now with dealing with the streets, that we're going to come up with a solution for the city that is just so not going to work for us. And, you know, we've been through so many situations like this where we point this out and the community points it out. And then in the end, the plan that works for most of the rest of the city is, you know, imposed on us as well. And it has a big impact on us. And I think that's a general concern right now. So I just want to reinforce that we have smaller streets, our sidewalks are narrower, and we have many, many of them that are dense with people that are not just tourists. I mean, the combination, it's a combination of everything. And I hope that you will keep that in mind.
Thank you, Susan. Casey, I don't know if you have any comment to that. Could you put up, hold on a second. Could you put up that slide with the email information that you had, so that way people can see that as well? And I don't know if you wanted to comment on what Susan Winberg had to say or not. But I was going to ask one last question.
Yeah, I can just briefly say that this plan really focuses on pedestrian mobility at a citywide scale. It definitely might not take into account some of the like very unique circumstances within a neighborhood or even within a street or maybe even within a block. Like there's always things that will come up where there might be unique circumstances. So I think this is just, as stated, like it's a starting point for conversation. And we used it to help guide policy, but it's not it's not like the definitive end of story. This is what it is kind of criteria.
Right. And so one other question that someone had was about taking the like I think that I'm not sure this did this plan like, so what about the areas, and I'm thinking of specifically in our district on 7th Avenue where we do have a very large sidewalk. We do have a lot of it that's taken over by the subway grades. And so how does that work? And I know this is at a citywide scale, but just kind of thinking in how is something like that taken into consideration, especially, you know, let's say, for instance, which also is on 7th Avenue as well, where that the subway grade, and I know that there's outdoor dining rules related to that, and I'm not asking you about that, but just in thinking of the use and the clear path requirements there, as well as then understanding there might be, you know, sidewalk dining there as well. So that how that clear path becomes very different, right? Not being taken into consideration, I guess. I don't know. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, the walkable surface is definitely something that we would consider as part of this plan, like separate from like outdoor dining or anything. If you just had a sidewalk where almost all of it was like cellar doors. Cellar doors are like kind of terrifying to a lot of people. Like we don't count that, or I don't think we would count that as clear path. If we were to do a project or have recommendations for like any improvements to the sidewalk. A quality walking surface is definitely something we would strive for as part of this, for both the walk lane and the clear path. Understanding that there's also a whole host of like existing conditions, like we're not going to move a subway station to move vents somewhere else, but like it is an acknowledgement, for sure.
Okay. Did you have one? Did you have one?
Well, I just want clarification, and I don't think I'm getting it, but how will this and all this plan work hand in hand with the dining out program? Is it designed for that? In other words, we're concerned about clear path in relationship to the dining out guidelines. So is this designed to work hand in hand with that? Or are they so completely separate that they really have nothing to do with each other? I'm very confused.
No, I think the pedestrian plan was developed entirely separate. It's really about creating space for walking as a form of transportation. That was the goal of the plan, and that was what, when the plan was being created, that was the sole goal of it. It then was used as a tool to provide the starting point for developing outdoor dining regulation, because it set the stage for determining space for walking as a form of transportation. And it had done a lot of the legwork for identifying that like streets are different and may need different design requirements. So it was, if the pandemic had never happened and outdoor dining had never expanded as it did, the pedestrian mobility plan would basically be the same as it's presented today, as a standalone initiative that prioritizes walking as a mode of transportation.
Right, and the way some streets are classified, and what does, so it incorporated into the outdoor dining rules. Yeah, and because of the classification, if we could stop the conversation, please. So it is part of the outdoor dining regulations because it's actually going to knock out some businesses. Again, I'm just talking very generally here to Casey in general, but just in general, like it does preclude some businesses from participating in certain sections of our community district because of the designation, and the required clear path is completely impossible to achieve. Now, there are some waivers to that in the regulations. And so this was designed to understand the clear path, what this is all about, because this is heavily referenced multiple times in the outdoor dining legislation and the regulations specifically. So these corridors are called out. People are trying to understand. I know I was on an industry presentation that DOT held last week, where restaurant owners were trying to understand how and why their street was classified a certain way. So this is certainly very relevant to both residents, operators as well. So again, this is really not a discussion or a referendum on how it's related or not. But with that, Casey, thank you so much for your time this evening. We're coming up right on the hour, and that's what I promised. So thank you for taking the time to go through that and to answer our questions. And thanks to Kate. I don't know if she's still on or not, but thank you very much. And is there a way for us to get a copy of this presentation, or is it on? I know that the website has the different graphics, but is this presentation readily available for distribution or not?
That's something we actually need to talk about, because our current structure for posting presentations typically goes to our current projects page, but this isn't a project. So I think we need to figure out how to share this in what form. So I think we can get back to you on that. Okay,
great. I'll work with Kate on that. Well, thank you. You are free to drop off, or if you want to stay on and listen, but we're just going to wrap up our meeting. So again, thank you, Kate and Casey from DOT. I believe someone put in the chat the email for feedback on that plan directly to DOT. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So generally we'll go to our business session and any new business. So if anyone wants to talk about what we just heard, or any thoughts on that, any of the questions that came up. Yeah.
I mean, it'd be nice if it really went hand in hand. That's all I can say.
Well, it was nice to hear that they take into account the existing registered restaurants, the DOMH permits, in calculating this. And just in that particular, right, it's the biggest challenge. Right, because it creates where the sidewalks are wider, it ensures that people are still able to move around within the community. So I think that
Well,
that's, I think that that's been, yeah, exactly.
But for the dining out, I guess that point that David brought up and several other people brought up is that we do have a kind of unique situation where we've got very narrow sidewalks and tremendous usage that isn't necessarily based on who lives or works here or even dines here.
And that
How do
precludes
you-
places from having them.
Sorry?
That precludes them from having outdoor dining, though, is that heavy use.
Well, it should, but
But
really,
well, it does. It's 8 feet on any street. And then the regional and the globals have either a 10 or a 12-foot clear path. And many of our sidewalks are narrower or more within that region. And
Not even
we've
8
heard more issues from restaurants saying, why can't we have a sidewalk cafe? Not the other way around.
so I guess the question is that when the applications do start coming, how will they be judged? Judge is a bad word. How will they be measured? Will DOT use these guidelines to really determine very specifically those clear paths? That's really what the.
Wow.
Yeah, it's in the rules.
Yeah.
It's
So,
in the rules.
right, I mean, I don't think the application makes it to us if it doesn't, if it's
Well,
on.
that's not the whole-
Yeah, I mean, well, that's what it seems to be, and whether you agree, you know, if people agree with that or not. It does seem it knocks out a lot of, I think it knocks out a lot more restaurants in places than you may think. Once you start to really look at the map, and if you go to the CB2 outdoor dining page, it has a link to the pedestrian map, and you can type in address and start to see places. But there was a genuine concern from operators in our district that were concerned that they would not be eligible for
Right.
sidewalk cafe. They have houses in Little Italy.
Well, we hope.
So where it comes into play is that previously sidewalk cafes were not permitted in residential districts. Period.
Right.
With this change, they are allowed, but they have the minimum requirement
But
of an
is there-
8-foot clear path.
Right.
What also is taken into account, because our built environment predates most of the zoning regulations.
Right.
And as a result, we have many non-conforming commercial uses within those residential districts. And what's been interesting is that the pedestrian mobility plan takes that into account, in that if there are restaurants that are non-conforming to the underlying zoning, they have a DOHMH permit, and that's taken into the calculation of what street type, or the way a street is categorized. For example, Carmine Street is an example, which I'll look, but I believe that has a 10-foot requirement, even though most of Carmine Street is a residential.
It's an R zone.
It's an R zone within it, and it has so many non-conforming uses that the sidewalk requirements were raised, and I believe it is a regional corridor. I could be wrong, but I think that's what it's categorized.
Yeah, it's comes off Clarkson Street, which comes off the US highway as a entry into Manhattan.
Right.
And they switch, so like Sullivan off Houston is one. I forget, one's regional, one's global, like side to side, so it's all, and they change, right, as the block faces go
So they were
on.
actually categorized according to this mobility plan.
Yeah, every street, every street, like every street in the city is right in this is categorized. You can go see, like, you know, I think Christopher.
When there's a conflict between open restaurants and the mobility plan, the restaurants will prevail because that's regulatory.
That's right,
And this is only a guideline.
that's right.
But when there's no restaurants involved, this might be a good guideline. You know, I mean, we're here, we're like in restaurant town here. You go out to Bayside, there's no restaurants, but you know, this might be helpful. as guidelines for what? For who? New developers, for who's, for new development, obviously, you know. I mean, it's, you know,
Well, I mean, right, if you have a commercial space and this is more your wheelhouse than mine, and it's on a, you know, it's on a global corridor because of the pedestrian demand, pedestrian counts are very important, right? Right, so,
but we are focused on the restaurant.
We are.
Right.
That's what we're inundated with. But I'm sorry, Claudia, you're saying like on Carmine Street, it's been raised that you need 10 feet before an out.
But it's a regional corridor
Yeah,
and it requires a 10-foot clear path
okay,
and not 8-foot.
okay, so that means that they can't really have outdoor seating that's not roadbed seating.
Well, it depends on the width.
Yeah, but it's generally 10 feet kills it. Interesting.
Put in something about.
I saw that, yeah.
Liquor license.
yeah, I know that,
That's what you will do at the committee, if it's not 10 feet.
No, the DOT reviews all of this prior to the referring the application to the community board.
Okay,
So the diagram, which, you know, every applicant is required to provide a diagram, has to show the clearances to all the marked,
okay.
all the marked things in the dining out
They'll make it
program.
whether they.
And just, they're the ones who determine whether or not there can be roadbed or sidewalk cafe. We're simply providing feedback on that.
Okay, I guess.
So the way it's supposed to work is that DOT sees the measurements before it ever comes to us. And if there is not a sufficient clear path, they should simply be eliminated. The application.
Presumably, that's how it will work. I don't think today any applications have been referred to any community board yet.
Not to us, I think.
no, there is, and there is a provision, it's on page, for those that follow along in the rules, on page 17, where it does say that notwithstanding, the minimum width of the required clear path on regional corridors, the minimum width of the required clear path shall be 8 feet. On regional corridors when it's.
But what you're
It's 10. It's down at 10 feet in the guidelines, but it can go down to 8 if. And it's a very loose language of maintenance of a 10-foot clear path after installation of such sidewalk cafe is not feasible. And so how is that going to be
So-
interpreted by?
So is DOT going to say, okay, you have only 8 feet, but well, into the 8-foot determination?
You
You don't know.
would have a case.
Right. So, yeah, so any other comments, as Carter mentioned, we have not had any applications referred to us yet. I was not really expecting any for this month, which is why we've been wanting to have this presentation from DOT for a while on the clear path. There have been community board trainings on the Dining Out NYC portal. I know a couple of folks here have attended those. There's been industry presentations.
Did they invite us to this?
The community board ones, yes. And they were doing those on a borough-wide scale, so DOT's not really coming to speak about Dining Out NYC to individual community boards at this time. So there's been borough-wide trainings about how the portal works, and I think the most interesting of those is really the what comes out of the Q&A, because this is also nuanced. And as I said, from the industry one, the different questions of the operators of, you know, I have this type of parking regulation, can I have a roadway? And it's a very clear no. If it's, you know, if it's not one of those types of streets, parking lane designations that's in the rules, I'm not going to go and memorize all those, spit them out here, but it was very clear. And so there is going to be this review by them before anything's referred to us. So I guess stay tuned for that. And, you know, I know that they are working on a public facing portal for all of the information that applicants submit. We are going to do our own kind of version of a Google Drive to have all of those materials that are public facing so that the public can see the site plan, any non-proprietary information, and so that when we do have the applications, that you are able to come with concrete information based on something in the plan or whatnot. So, you know, we're in this kind of period right now where maybe you see an operator with an existing certification in the temporary program making changes, or it seems they're building something new or whatnot, but we have not received any applications. I'm sure that operators are making changes either to start getting in compliance before an application's in, or they put one in. You know, the August 3rd is the deadline for anyone in the temporary program to apply for the permanent program. The portal does not close. So August 4th, someone can still apply if they've had a temporary setup, or if they've had, or they're just a new restaurant opening up. So it's not that you can't submit anything after August 4th, it's just you'll be in violation if you're in the temporary program and haven't applied yet by that date. I'd asked the question of, you know, okay, are we gonna get to this point where we have someone that's in the new program and then we have temporary setups still up because there's still that crossover? How do you make a complaint, or how do you put in for a corrective action request? And it's 311, and you know, DOT had said that they will on their end figure out what is being applied here, if it's not in compliance with the new program because they have already had their license approved and the new program, then they will be set against those, you know, and if they are not in the temporary, you know, if they're still, so file your, you know, so the long story short is to file a complaint.
Yeah, just to file the complaint, that's up to the agency to make a determination on how to resolve it. What is most helpful, from what I understand over the duration of this program, is to also include clear pictures and to file those complaints utilizing either the 311 app or online. And what the pictures do is they're very helpful in communicating to the agency what the condition was at the time that you viewed the problem.
File it
And
with the DOT.
With 311 for the sidewalk, sidewalk complaints. And
Then bring those numbers to the, you know, to the office so that we can follow up on them. That's the best way. Is we love seeing, you know, we appreciate the photos and all of but if anything that comes with that 311 number is so much more actionable on our end to follow up and with the different agencies on that.
Okay. And with respect to pictures, when you are taking your pictures, please look at them and ask yourself, does this picture communicate the condition to the agency? Because in the moment, so often, what happens is that the picture that's taken doesn't show the underlying condition very clearly, and it's difficult for the agency to act on it. And so you have to, I often recommend taking a far away shot of whatever the situation
in real context
and getting a little bit closer. But it's very important to document because you're the one there. And if you want to explain it, just look at your picture to make sure it conveys that situation. And in the moment, that's not always so easy to think about, but that's very important. Particularly, as all of you know, the situation changes each day, the weather changes, whatever is out there, the problem. And so you just want to capture it at the moment.
Okay, good advice.
Yeah, and the restaurants will be submitting, or are required to submit a photo of 3 angles of their frontage. And so we will make as much information that we have access to download and put in that folder for that specific application. So when you see a list of applications on the CB2 calendar or website, they won't be individually linked. We'll have a link to the Google Drive for that month. so that you can see the folders with the different materials, because it's just such a subset of materials. So, with that,
And DOT has told us this is a work in progress.
Yeah.
To some extent.
Sure seems to be.
And, you know, there will be clarification, I think, after the initial applications are referred to the community boards. It'll become very clear what the way that they're interpreting the regulations. And so until then, we won't know some of the minutia details that I know are of extreme interest to members in our community, particularly as how they relate to measurements and things of that sort, because the rules seem very clear, but then if you go to the practical aspect of measuring, it's not so clear.
And we've had no applications at all asking for this.
from
They-
what I understand, when I last asked at a public meeting, I was told there were less than 100 applications citywide, and it was maybe a week or two ago.
But they have until August 3rd, right?
So they should be coming in a lot soon,
Some
next month.
wait, make
Presumably,
themselves a little more.
presumably.
We've been told that DOT will refer the applications within 5 days once the applications are complete. But we are not the determiners of that, and that's what DOT is.
Are from a complete and accurate application, then they have 5 days for sidewalk, and then 5 calendar days for sidewalk, and
You're
10
gonna be inundated.
calendar days for roadway.
And some of those have been, from what we were told, some changes in the requests to the applicants that they found that were insufficient in their questions. And so they had been requesting some additional information that was not clearly asked for. For example, I think that one of the examples they had mentioned was insurance, that they had changed the manner in which they were requesting copies of insurance coverage. And so I think they're still working on matching the regulations of what would be a complete application and before they're referred to us.
So it's a lot more detailed than just fitting into the
Yes,
design.
and we've been told many of those issues are not relevant to community boards. They have to do with just the legislative and the regulatory questions and other issues in that area. Whereas we're very, you know, our review is a lot of the existing conditions and commenting on that.
I need some clarification about the temporary program. I know that the temporary structures, the folks that have them have to apply for the new program by August 3rd. How long are the temporary structures allowed to stay in operation?
Once the application is the final approval, they have 30 days from that approval to come into compliance with the new program. And for roadway dining, and for roadway dining, there is a deadline, which is November
30th.
Yeah, November 30th, that they have the temporary program. You cannot have like roadbed dining after November 30th, even if you haven't been approved, that still has to be removed, but
And 4 months
30
later,
days.
and then 4 months later, you could put it up again.
If you've received
Yeah, if
the
you
new
receive it,
license, right?
That's right.
But obviously, this is a transition process, which, and they, yeah. And they've told us that they will try to deliver these applications to the board in a digestible fashion. However, as our community board has previously had the most
Outdoor
dining licenses under the previous program, it's unclear what that means.
You're gonna get inundated anyway.
Right, and kind of the, right, so we have our liaison at DOT who will be referring the applications to us. Once we have access to the Dining Out NYC portal from the administrator standpoint, I think we'll be able to see the queue of applications, but they will not, that is not being able to see them in that queue is not the formal referral that's done via email to tell us what is completed, and it'll be clear, I think, in the portal as well. But, you know, what they're looking for from feedback from us is comments related to the cafe setup, comments related to the cafe setup's physical footprint, comments related to the pedestrian flow around the cafe setup, so kind of tying in with today's presentation, and then comments related to the conflicts with current curb use.
What does that mean? Curb use.
On the sidewalk,
So-
rather than in the,
I think, you know, if you have
would be on the roadway.
any type of a conflict where there's a heavy curb use that might increase the usage of that sidewalk, they would like to know about it from us as the local community. And they may take those comments into account in any types of changes they might
Just out of
recommend.
curiosity, what would be an example of heavy curb use?
You know, for example, if you had a truck loading and unloading zone that's heavily used for unloading trucks, and, you know, you have a commercial building that's in immediate proximity, and that the usage there is in such a way that that's
Like the way.
yeah, I mean, they'd like to know about that, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they may recommend a modification, but that's the type of local knowledge that may not come up on, you know, their review process.
And I think part of that is also, and this was I think something in the chat about people and guests or patrons on the street and clogging it up, and good order is also one of the operation requirements, right? Like preventing that excessive congregation of patrons on the street. But to close out kind of those, beyond those three specific areas of how our feedback should be channeled into those, there is also a bucket of general comments of, you know, they were asked, DOT was asked, you know, are you going to take into consideration past behavior in the temporary program or past, you know, for bad actors? And
What they say.
so they said that, you know, you can include it, and it, you know, they will review it, but it's not something that's in the it's not in the regulations. that they have.
Very opinionated as to what a bad.
Yeah, so it's very open interpretation.
Quality.
And so that's where if the things about noise or anything like that.
If they get 50 letters like that or 20 letters like that.
Yeah, you sort of feedback will go in that general bucket of just an FYI to them that they are not. It's not in the regulations and they have to take it into
Right,
consideration.
it's not a bucket necessarily.
So while we were waiting for the applications, we thought that tonight's topic
Yeah,
would be a good way to understand how this program is being utilized. And that really came out of looking at the streets and being surprised at why certain streets were categorized in a certain fashion, and trying to have them come to explain that. In Carmine Street and other streets are examples of that, so that we could just have more clarity and also understand, you know, for us, just to larger introduce the concept of, you know, of the sidewalk free flowing movement of pedestrians on the sidewalk, which we've talked about for years and years. And this seems to be one of the first steps that the city has taken, because we have an as-built environment, and how this is going to be utilized going forward. And the new outdoor dining program, because it removed so many specific areas that were precluded from having outdoor dining before, this becomes a much more important.
Sure.
Because we had some high corridors that were specifically
Right.
excluded as named areas where there could not be outdoor dining. So the transition through that, you know, is of interest to our community in that manner. And the pedestrian mobility plan really ties directly into that. And
I'm gonna move to base.
understanding.
So you can have a clear path.
And it was interesting to hear that this can change the designation for the streets. And so I'm sure that will come up down the road.
Well, what you said was interesting, where there's a kind of a 2-foot interpretation from the 8 to 10 feet on a regional corridor.
Yeah, if you look at it, so the whole reason I got tuned into this is because when I was going through the regulations, it's cited, these corridors are cited so many times.
Is that subjective? Is that very subjective?
What, the,
10 feet variance or waiver or?
it's not clear. I mean, they also says in there, I just have it in my calendar, that the small, what is it? So the exceptions, right, are that if you maintenance of a 10-foot clear path after installation of such sidewalk cafe is not feasible, and such sidewalk cafe is located within an area where only small sidewalk cafes were permitted prior to the date that these rules take effect, as shown on the department's website. So there's a couple of those streets and like we're small enclosed. I don't think I linked them on the website, but I won't try to go to them now. I think I sent them to the working group. So those streets are like Center Street from Canal Street to Spring Street, Lafayette Street from Canal Street to Houston, 6th Avenue from Canal to a line 100 feet south of Spring Street. Whatever part, if any part of the CB2 is in the Special Union Square Special District, and then 14th Street from a line 100 feet west of University Place to 8th Avenue, and then 5th Avenue from 12th Street up to 14th Street would be what matters for us, but that goes on much.
Does it talk about the slid at all?
Does not talk about the slid. Does not talk about the slid, so. Anyways, so.
So we're kind of at an end, right?
Huh?
We're at an end.
At an end?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So we can kind of wrap up our business session if there's no other comments. I did say that, we were gonna approve the March minutes. Those were sent out, by the office, as part of the packet from last month. So if you have any, it's just if there's a motion to approve those, just so I have them on. Okay, great. So I'll write up the minutes for this evening's meeting. Our next meeting dates, I'm not gonna show the slide, but we have, I just have us for one time a month, and it may, let's see what happens. We know there's a 30-day clock and there's a 40-day clock, and it's not clear either, when if we were to get from an operator an application for both at the same time, which would make logical sense, but the timing of how that would work, we're not sure yet. So that we will receive an assigned deadline from DOT for every application we receive. That's within what's in the regulations, 30-day for sidewalk, 40-day for sidewalk, and 30-day for roadway. So our next meeting is Monday, May 13th, then Monday, June 10th. For July, I'll need to send out an email so what people's availability is, because I think that's what's going to be our heavy month. And right now we're listed for the Monday of full board, and I think that's not productive for any of us. So we may need to have meet on July 8th. That's a Monday. Yeah, so that way we can have enough time, because I think really as well, I think a lot of the work is going to be done for that meeting. In terms of, because we're not having applicants present to us, as I discussed at the last meeting, because we're going to have such a high volume. So if there's anyone that has something to say about an application, we will ask that from the public or the applicant. And then
it's on us actually to ascertain the information that we're being given by DOT. I mean, to go out there and see whatever other variations there are.
Well, yeah,
We're dependent on the community feeding in.
This question was asked and presented to DOT. And what they said is that they will use their resources that they have available to them to review to have their plan examiners reviewing the sidewalk plans, review them, and as part of that process of applying, applicants also submit pictures, of the situation, right? And as we have during the liquor licensing process, we've started to have people in advance of this, seek to include these in their future licenses. The as-built conditions vary tremendously. And, some of our sidewalks have transformers on them, for example, and they require certain measurement. Some of them have exhaust ducts or intake ducts. So there's a lot of the as-built environment that needs to be reviewed that theoretically they will have already looked at them. There is a list that the applicants are supposed to provide. And I think the open question, which is not clear, is if we find something that is not included, what happens then as far as a corrective action? And when does that happen?
And does that site
Does
plan
that
get
come
updated?
back to us? Does the site plan get updated? And does it come back to us? Or what happens then? But they were not able to provide us with that. And we do not know what the public facing portal will look like. We do not know what information they will provide to the public will look like after the license has been issued. So there's a lot of open questions that I think, that we have to
Yeah.
find out.
I mean, we're supposed to comment, right?
Right.
So how do we?
And one of the important things to mention is outdoor dining was very successful pre-pandemic in our community board. And we had very little complaints. There were not many issues. There were some outliers. But look,
To the regulations.
yeah, and it was very clear. And a big part of that was because there were diagrams that were crystal clear. The licenses indicated how many seats and tables that each applicant had, and those licenses were posted.
Absolutely correct.
And one of the issues that I had raised was we would like to see that be available and very clear so that it removes
The ambiguity.
the ambiguity. And so that it's just,
But now you can have outdoor cafe tables, you can have roadbed dining. I mean, it's really kind of an as-of-right situation, and we've lost control of that very good, and we did have a very good working system, for outdoor tables.
but that previous program was as of right as well.
Yes. it was.
And that was established through a court case. Through our city board,
Well,
which was Jackson
I know,
University,
University.
University Place,
But nonetheless, they had to file it with us and had to be reviewed by us, notwithstanding the Jack's court case at the university. And then you'd have people like Mike Kelly come in with diagrams, or an architect come in with a diagram. And that was what it was. That's what we did.
And the biggest changes, just so everybody knows, in the past to most of the submissions under the previous program were sometimes at a corner where it was a little too sharp. They might remove a table and chair. There, some of the small details that smooth the issues out. And there's room within this program as well to do that, to make recommendations for that. And the applicants can accept them or not accept them, and then DOT can make their final
So
determination.
if the university lawsuit said it's as right, that was it? Is that what the judge? was?
I
Was it-
don't remember the
Or
exact.
was it just that specific location?
No, I think it was in general that that the city, I believe it had to do with city council couldn't say no. They could request modifications. That's my memory. You'd have to go back and look at it, but it was that you could recommend modifications, but you couldn't say no outdoor, no outdoor. That was a totally separate case under a totally separate program. This is brand new.
I'm just curious what the court said.
Yeah.
And was that a C1 overlay on university?
But
All right, I'll let you guys finish that conversation later. But I'm gonna close this out. Is there any new business that anyone wants to raise?
That's quite enough.
Right, okay. Thank you. So with that, is there a motion to adjourn?
Sure.
so moved.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and thanks to all the committee members who are here, and Susan Kemp, our board chair, as well.
Oh.
Thanks, Valerie.
Thanks, Stella. Thanks, Donna.
Oh, I think
Thanks to Wittenberg.
Mr. Carter, really, because he would remember, I